I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us tonight for Writing Matters, From Research to Writing. My name is Molly Rogers. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for the Humanities at NYU. I'm also the moderator for tonight's event. I'm standing in for Ulrich Baer, who's the director of the center, who unfortunately had a scheduling conflict and so couldn't make it tonight. But I'm very pleased to moderate this event, which is the first in a series on writing that we're offering this year. So for this evening's event, which is on turning your research into writing, I'm going to first introduce our panelists, and then we're going to have brief remarks from each of them. Then we'll go into questions, and I'll start the Q&A off. So I want to introduce our panelists. First up, we have my first panelist to introduce is Rachel L. Swarns, who I want to also note is a faculty fellow with the center this year. So we're really pleased that she has agreed so early in her association with the center to participate in this event. Rachel is a journalist, an author, and professor. She writes about race and race relations as a contributing writer for the New York Times. Her articles about Georgetown University's roots in slavery touched off a national conversation about American universities and their ties to this painful period of history. Ms. Swarns is an associate professor of journalism at NYU. She's the author of American Tapestry, the story of the Black, white, and multiracial ancestors of Michelle Obama, which was published by Amistad, an imprint of HarperCollins. And this book traced the journey of Mrs. Obama's forebears from slavery to the White House in 5 generations. She's also the co-author of Unseen, Unpublished Black History from the New York Times Photo Archives, which was put out by Black Dog and Leventhal in 2017. Her forthcoming book about Georgetown's roots in slavery will be published by Random House. Our second panelist is Theresa McPhail. She is a medical anthropologist at Stevens Institute of Technology and a former journalist. She's the author of The Viral Network, a pathography of the H1N1 influenza pandemic, published by Cornell, and dozens of pieces of writing on advice for the Chronicle of Higher Education. Her research centers on the social, cultural, and political aspects of global health, infectious disease, and medicine. Her next book, which I was asking her about before we opened the event, is called Irritated, and it examines the global rise of allergies and will be published by Random House in 2022. And I'm hoping I can order a copy this early, but maybe that's too soon. In any case, I want to welcome both of our panelists, Rachel and Theresa. We're first going to hear from Theresa, who's going to have a few comments for us.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you for inviting me to this today. So I'm just going to give a general tips for wherever you are in whatever stage you are in transitioning from your research and data collection phase to your writing phase, which is often a moment of great trepidation and anxiety. So I just have a few things, and then hopefully we'll get more specific in the Q&A. The first thing, so I've just done this. I mean, I'm in the writing phase right now, and I did about 2 years of data collection for this book that I'm writing right now. So I feel pretty good about talking to you guys about this right now, since I have recent experience. One of the things I think you should do is, before you start writing, go back through your data, especially if you've done a long period of data collection. So if you've been at something for like a year, 6 months, go back through your research and take notes on your own research. As it might even feel fresh to you. You might even have forgotten some of the things that you found. And as you're doing that, like, try to summarize your arguments, the arguments of the things that you were taking a look at. Try to pick out moments that are interesting to you, like key quotes, highlight those, have them somewhere, and try to think about sorting things into themes, which might end up being chapters for a larger project. This is mostly for a larger project, which could end up being an article, some of these themes. So just try to get a sense of what you have. And don't assume you know, because I think one of the things that happens, it certainly happened with me, is I started my research with historical archives and then went to interviews and surveys. And I think what happens over time is that you get fixated on whatever you're doing now, and you forget about the data that you just did, 3 months ago. So it's kind of good to like take a step back and go, okay, let's remember what I've done here to kind of see what you have. And then the next step is kind of finding your so what. One of the struggles of turning research into writing is figuring out what you just did all of this work for. So figuring out your so what. So the more you know, the more research you do, the harder this is. Because the more you start thinking that everything you found out is so cool and so critical to this story that you want to tell, that you start to want to jam pack everything in. So you need to figure out what is really key. I often tell people to do that by imagining a reader outside of your field, someone who has nothing to do with what you've just done, and think, what do they need to know? What is crucial for them to understand what you want to tell them? What is at stake in what you just did? That'll help you separate the wheat from the chaff in your data as well. Not everything has to go in. I know it's hard. Have a folder. You don't have to delete it, but you can't possibly fit all your research into your writing. And that's a big hang up for a lot of people. You just got to pick and choose. You can't tell the whole story. You can't tell A to Z. You're telling A to E, or you're telling a segment. Next, before you attempt to write the thing, don't do that to yourself. Don't try to go from your research data and open up a brand new Word document and type chapter 1. Please don't do that to yourself. That's a lot of pressure. Try to do a sketch, do outlines, do maybe handwritten, maybe online, maybe using visualization software. Try to write chapter descriptions if it's a dissertation or a longer book. Try to force yourself to envision the arc as a whole. It's hellish. There was nothing worse in this whole process for me than taking all the research I had and writing a book proposal. But it was also the best thing I ever did because it's saving me in the writing time. So try to do that if you can. Try to formulate the chapter descriptions. Try to do an outline of an article. You know, just try to give yourself the framework before you sit down with that blank page blinking at you, chapter 1 or, introduction. The next thing is when you do start writing, writing is thinking. So give yourself permission to write in an exploratory kind of messy fashion. What you are putting on that page is not going to end up in the same format, and don't get hung up on perfectionism or, this doesn't feel right. Of course it doesn't, because you're thinking through the arguments. Even after you've done the outline, you're going to work things out as you are writing them. So keep that in mind and try to give yourself permission to write, as Anne Lamott famously says, a shitty first draft, right? We've all heard this a million times, but it cannot be more true. And lastly, it takes some time. And why is that? Why should you let yourself explore? Because it takes a long time to really find your structure in a piece of writing. Structure, I don't know if Rachel's going to agree with me. I think structure, finding that thread, is the hardest part of writing. At least it is for me, because it's always different too. Every piece of writing that you do is going to have a different structure, and you're going to have to find it every single time. That takes some time. So whatever time you think you're going to spend on this writing project, double it or triple it even, because it's going to take some time, especially underline, for those larger projects, for when you are dealing with a lot of data and you are trying to write a book-length thing. Definitely give yourself lots more time than you think you're going to need, because you're going to stumble a few times. So you want to pad in some moments for you to just be like, this isn't working, and figure out your path. So you don't want to put extra pressure on yourself. And I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Theresa. Rachel?
So I'm really thrilled to be here. This question about translating research and reporting into sparkling prose is something I've wrestled with for almost all of my professional life. I'm wrestling with it right now in my next book. So it's really important to me. I'm really glad to be here. I think it's also important, particularly to be talking about it now during this pandemic, when so many of us feel so overburdened and when writing feels so challenging, I mean, maybe out of reach, especially for those of us who are parents or caregivers and juggling homeschooling and caregiving on top of teaching and coursework and everything. And I hope maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm having to share some of the strategies that have proved helpful to me on that front, though I have to admit that that is still very much a work in progress. And I want to say up front that even though I've been a professional writer for more than 2 decades, the blank screen still feels pretty terrifying to me sometimes. With my first book, I can still remember the moment that I realized that I had to write 1,500 words a day to make my deadline. And I have to say, I wanted to hide under my desk. The good news is I didn't do that, but I definitely know what that kind of anxiety feels like. I also want to say from the outset that my approach, people have different approaches to writing, and that my suggestions come from a particular place, a particular type of experience, from my work as a journalist, writing for newspapers, and as an author writing for trade publications. So just be aware of that. Theresa's here, and she can talk about academic journals and academic presses. So I think you've got a good team for you tonight. And we're very much in sync. I always love listening to other writers talk about their writing because I learn a lot too. I'm always learning a lot. One of the things I'm going to say, actually, because I know there are some of you who are all done with your research and ready to dive in, that we often think about these things as very separate things, your research and your writing. To be honest with you, for me, it's much more of a symbiotic process. And even though that makes a lot of sense, of course, how do you know what you're going to say until you do your research? I would say that I write as I go a bit during the research, and I'd encourage people to think about that. And the reason why I say that is that sometimes those flashes of insight occur to you while you have found something, you're in the archives, you've seen something, all of a sudden oh my gosh, wouldn't that be an amazing scene? That is the argument. I can see it now. What do we do with those moments? When we've got a multi-year project, we talk to a friend about it, right? And say, or a colleague, and say, oh my gosh, you won't believe what I found. I would suggest do that. I'd also suggest write it down. Not in a, this is gonna be chapter 4 way, but I'd suggest for longer projects to keep almost like a writing log or a writing journal. Hammer out a few lines of that argument or that vivid description that came to you of that person or of that scene. And I certainly, I don't worry about structure in that, but as Theresa was saying, when you're writing, especially like a dissertation or a book that is a multi-year project, that insight is so alive with you right then. 2 years from now, it's not. And when it's powerful and real to you, sometimes that paragraph there might be much more vivid and real than it will be you trying to excavate it later on. Organizing your materials. I would say, because I'm a big one for research and organizing can get in the way of writing, and I don't want you to do that. But organizing is very important. You can organize forever. It's a nice procrastination tool. But organizing is important. And one thing for the work that I do, and again, this may not be relevant for everyone, but timelines for me are really helpful in organizing my material. Again, I write a lot about history, but if you're writing about policy and looking at the evolution of a kind of a policy, or if you're writing about biography or something like that, I do feel like having a timeline of events is really helpful. It is the beginning of thinking about structure. Sometimes it may have nothing to do with your structure, but sometimes you can start seeing where you might open and close things. And you'll certainly start seeing how things interlock with each other. Like Theresa said, hammer out your theme, your argument. What is it? That is really going to be your guide It's so important. I just say, and again, this may change, so don't feel like, oh my gosh, I don't know what it is, or it's this and maybe it's that. Just think about that and kind of try and write that out. The next thing, we're talking about sparkling prose. Don't worry about sparkling prose. I care earnestly about it, but don't worry about it when you've got your outline, you've hammered out your argument, you have your timeline, you've got your materials organized. Sparkling prose can really paralyze you. It certainly can. I can polish and polish and polish and polish and polish, and spend a day polishing. That doesn't get me very far. An editor I know put up a sign on his computer that said, "Don't write, type." And that's because sometimes writing and the idea of sparkling prose can be paralyzing. There's so much psychological baggage that we have in it's your first book, it's your dissertation. It's so meaningful that you may never even get out of bed, right? So I would say, don't worry about sparkling prose. Writing is about rewriting. And you will never get to sparkling prose if you actually don't start writing. So I agree with that kind of awful draft, that terrible first draft. I am writing a terrible first draft right now. It makes me feel good to say. But I think that, that idea of sparkling prose and inspiration comes from the discipline of doing it. We'll talk a little more, I hope, about practices, because I think practice is really important too. And I would say just very quickly that I think that it's really important to write every day. And I think we'll talk more about that as we go. But I'm very interested to hear about Theresa's practices.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. Wow. Some terrific advice off the bat, great start. Thank you so much. I want to ask a couple of questions, and then we will go very soon to the questions from our audience, which we've already had some really great ones. But I want to ask you, Rachel, you started by saying that you're working on your next book now, you're working on another book. And do you feel that you start all over when you start a new project? Or is there some sort of continuity to it? Is it a matter of you have to kind of clear the decks and then it's almost like reinventing the wheel? Or do you feel that you get a little more kind of versed in your technique as you go?
I think that, of course, a new subject is always new, right? It's a different thing. But I think, I'm learning all the time about both from, my previous work, both things that, I did well that I can continue to do, and things that I did not do so well. I think one of the things that's been interesting for me now as a faculty member is learning and thinking about writing a book while teaching. And this is an experience that, of course, many of you have. You're juggling. For journalists, that's what we do. We are researching and writing, and that's all we're doing. So for me, what's been new this time around is trying to figure out how to do that juggle. And whether you're doing your dissertation or whether you are teaching, how do you don't have endless blocks of time to do it. And so trying to figure out what that balance is has been an interesting challenge. But I think there's things that you learn and you build on, I think, as you go.
So it gets easier. Maybe not.
Yes and no.
Okay. We can come back to that. Theresa, we've had one question about sort of outlining and editing, which relates to a question I had. And your suggestion to forget that we forget the old data and to go back over all the research material to make it all fresh, to make it all now, because what you maybe did 2 years ago is completely forgotten and it doesn't seem relevant, but of course it was at one point. You also said about leaving stuff out, but how do you know what to leave out? Now you said you can imagine a reader, a sort of ideal reader, and many of the graduate students here will have, dissertation advisors and people who I presume are their, ideal reader in many respects. But this question of how do you know what to leave out, and how does that relate to the outline? What does that mean to the outline, and what happens if you have an outline and then you get to chapter 2 and then you realize, uh-oh, chapter 3 doesn't really follow now that I'm writing, do I have to start, so it's about structure and material and process all at once. So I'm going to throw that whole big ball of wax at you.
Well, thanks so much.
Pick out of it what you want. You don't have to do it all.
I think so. Wow, I should have been writing that down. You just exploded.
What happens if an outline,
I got exploded.
What happens if your outline just sort of suddenly falls apart?
It will. That's my answer, and I hate to say it to you. That's why I said, it takes some time to find your argument. I think the benefit, so if you haven't done, by the way, Rachel, I love this research log, writing log. I am stealing this. I do this naturally, but I didn't have a term for it, and I just love that. So if you haven't, if you've already done this and you're like, oh no, I wasn't doing the research log, that's kind of what I mean by go back through. You have an opportunity to do that retroactively. And by doing that, by kind of reading through, and you're basically, I would call it, I think of those little things that I write to myself, after every interview, I'll write a note saying, this part of this interview was spectacular. This is what I learned in this interview. And those I think of as Lego blocks, my writing Lego blocks. And what you're doing when you're finding your structure is you are moving those blocks around, which is why it's important to keep them in blocks at the beginning. Because you are going to figure out oh, wait, I'm trying to talk about something in chapter 2 that actually I need to back up and talk about this other thing. But you didn't know that until you attempted to tell the story. And so then you're going to be like, well, I guess there's a chapter 1.5. That's going to happen naturally. But as you're going through and trying to tell yourself what's important about these things, it allows you to remember stuff you've forgotten, but it also what it really does for me is it helps me see the connections between all the different materials that I have. So when I go back through my own notes that I've taken, so those little Lego blocks, but also going back through some of the, skimming some of the things that I've done before, rereading through my interviews, what I'm really doing is letting my brain make those connections between things. That you start seeing the patterns because it's all right there. And then suddenly you realize, oh, for me, there's this really cool story about in allergy research. It's from the very beginning of allergy, and it's a discovery story. And it's this great story about 2 rich dudes on a yacht that was given to them by a prince, and they accidentally killed their favorite dog with sea anemone toxin. And they're like, oh, hey, we've discovered anaphylaxis. Now that's a really cool story, right? You definitely want to hear it. And the dog's name is Neptune. And so here's the thing though, this is what I mean. You get fixated on that story and you're like, well, Neptune's got to go in this book. He doesn't. This book is not going to contain that story. And so what you're really trying to let yourself do is find the themes naturally, not impose them. And that will lead to a more organic structure that will still change because your thinking will change as you're writing. So you have an outline like my chapter descriptions. If you saw the book I proposed to Random House and compared it to the book that will come out, you'll be like, what happened? This is not the same book.
Sure. Of
course. So you basically are trying to find those things, and you have to be strict with yourself. If there's a cool story like that, put it in a file. Maybe that's an article. Maybe that's a one-off little piece somewhere. It doesn't mean it's not interesting, but over time you'll figure out what you're actually arguing about, and that thing will have things that have to go in there to support the argument, and everything else is extraneous. That's the hardest part, because you've spent so long doing this and you want everything to count. You want all 50 interviews to get into this book. That's impossible. So it's just learning to discipline yourself by going back through your research logs. I love this. I love that idea. So I don't know if I answered that question. That was
a brilliant answer.
If I could interject too, I just think what she said is so important in terms of like your outline. Sometimes we feel like, I mean, because writing, we see a book, right? It's solid. It's kind of permanent, but writing isn't that way. And so your outlines, it's not a failure if you realize that, oh my goodness, I outlined it and it just doesn't come together. That's what this process is. Actually, you're doing that so that you can figure that out. And if you know that going in, then it's less terrifying and kind of exciting. Sometimes you do this and you realize, oh my gosh, that was a calamity. But look at this. If I moved, and the Lego blocks are, it's exactly right. You're going to be writing and you're going to have it. Sometimes I say to people, like, being a writer is like the most exciting, powerful thing. You can move things around, you can move time, you can, and you're going to do that. And so, but you do need to actually have an outline, and you do need to write something to do that. But so it's not a failure, and be open to kind of the possibilities that emerge when you're doing it.
Fantastic. One of our speakers, and maybe one of our audience, and maybe others too, also missed what exactly research log is. Rachel, can you just briefly say that again so that they can get that?
This is not a technical term. So really, it is just what I was saying is that sometimes we think about research as one thing and writing as another. But often, like, our best insights, our flashes of, oh my gosh, happen actually while we are doing research. And so I was saying that I would not keep them so far apart. And when those things happen to you, when you find something and you say, oh my gosh, that argument, that's what I see, write it down. Don't worry about, this is not kind of, you're not kind of saying, okay, this is my structure, but you're saying that thing, I could see that scene, write it down. And I was just calling it, I just came up with it right now, a research log, a research journal that you'll have, because those ideas are fresh with you when it happens. And you might tell a friend, which is what we normally do, but it's better to write it down, tell your friend, but write it down so that a year from now, you can go back and it will still be written with that excitement and power that you had, and you'll remember it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't get the sense that either of you lack for motivation in your work, but we all have days when we flag a little bit, and it's sometimes difficult. And maybe this also speaks to, Rachel, what you were saying earlier, alluding to about the pandemic affecting our ability to focus and find time. And so we have a question, which is, how do you motivate yourself to write and edit? Okay, either of you can take this, or both.
It's a great question, and it is a challenge that, I mean, it is a perennial challenge. And so I think really sometimes, like, you can't rely on motivation. Actually, you can't. That's the bottom line. You know, during this pandemic, you know, I have kids, I had no school, everything, the weight of everything. I'm on a tenure track. I still have to write. So what I say is, you know, write every day. I mean, and that's when I'm like, I think the practices are really important to think about, and be realistic with yourself about it, though. Like, you know, Robert Caro, and I have some book suggestions for people. He has a great book called Working, Robert Caro, Lyndon Johnson's biographer. And he says, you know, I write 1,000 words a day, and that is great. And I've had to do that. But sometimes we just can't do that. What's important, I think, is writing every day. So what that means to you, I don't know. Sometimes for me, I could write 100 words this summer, honestly, a day, 200 words. I honestly, it was just really difficult. But the practice of doing that kept me going. It kept my mind in my subject. It kept that the wheels working. I think that's really important. The other thing I would say about practice is that, so set a time that's good for you. That's, again, a realistic time. Sometimes we have ideas about when is a good time, like our aspirational ideas. Do what's realistic. Sometimes for me that was 4:30 a.m., not aspirational at all, but it was when I could do it. And stick to that if you can. I also find that if you have that block of time, whatever it is, and however, I like having, I'm a journalist, I like having a word count goal. I feel like it keeps me honest. But I've got that time, and then I sit there and I don't know, like, okay, well, what am I writing? So my writing days include a block of time for writing, and then a block of time for preparing for the next day's writing. Because that is what I've found makes that tiny block of time, even if it's only 100 words that I'm going to write, that I will actually be able to get up and sit up at my computer. My house is completely dark. It's 4:30 in the morning. I've got my cup of coffee. I'm barely alive, but I know what I'm writing because I thought about it the day before. And so I try to break it up in that way. And then it's not like motivation doesn't exist. We've picked these projects. We care about them. Inspiration is real and it's a beautiful thing. But sometimes like it comes in that daily practice.
It's about discipline. It sounds like it's about discipline. And what you're also speaking to, I think, is another question that we've had about how do you deal with writer's block. So again, it's that setting up that structure for yourself and that discipline. Theresa, I want you to be able to weigh in on this as well.
Well, I just am in love with Rachel because it's everything she just said. And it's often what I say. I used to run a dissertation boot camp, and that's exactly what I said. Pick a time, stick to it, make a commitment to yourself, let other people know, I'm not having, I mean, now when the pandemic, you don't have to worry about this as much, but like, I'm not having a latte with you, like I'm not going to go on that Zoom. I'm not doing that. This is what I'm doing. I'm committed to the writing, and let everyone know how important it is to you, so that they help you to sit down and do it. It's hard. Like, I will say that like a lot of people get away with, and for years I was this person, so I will just out myself, that you would go through these fallow periods and then you'd crunch it, right? You'd sit down and you'd work for 16 hours or something crazy, and you'd accomplish it. And because you're naturally talented, or you've been practicing for years, you get away with it, right? That's not sustainable. It's about building sustainable practices. And in that, Rachel is completely right. You need to do it daily, or most days of the week, like exercise, at least 5 days a week, right? You should be at least 30 minutes a day. Exactly like exercise. And if you can, I mean, it doesn't work for everybody, but like the Pavlovian training that comes along with the Pomodoro method. So this idea that you're going to set a timer for 25 minutes, and you're going to sit there and you're going to write for those 25 minutes. You're not doing anything else. And then you get to take a break in between. Training yourself, like after a while, your brain just does it. After a while, with enough practice, you can actually train yourself to sit down and you're just in writing mode. And that idea of leaving yourself breadcrumbs, of not, stop when you know the next argument that you need to make, or, oh, I need to do that. And because then you can jump right back to that. My biggest advice is don't burn out. Like so often, especially new writers, you'll catch a wave and you'll try to write it right into like Samborn. Like, don't do that. Get off the board while you're still going. Like, paddle back out. Like, don't try to keep going. Like, have a set time and then stop when it's time to stop. You can't actually, like, your brain does need the downtime. I love that idea of doing things that support the writing. Like, if you want to work a long day, then write for 2 hours, but then do 3 hours more research, or, play around with something else, do the bibliography, like do the things that don't require as much brain power, and save that for, trying to churn out new prose.
Great, thank you very much. We have a question about organization and how you keep all your source material, all your data, all your research organized, and then how do you start to then shuffle that into an outline, which is then turning into prose?
I'm going to start, and then I'm going to let Theresa handle it. Organization is so hard. But I do want to say, one thing that I'm doing differently with this book is I am using a platform. I'm using Scrivener. I mean, it's not for everyone, but I did not do that with my first book. But so, and Scrivener, you know, it allows you to upload your research, your documents, your photos. So it's both keeps all of your records in one place. It's a little terrifying. Yes, lots of backups. But it also is a writing platform as well. And so I can, at any given moment, I have it all there. I have, you know, and so that's really helpful. Again, like I love a timeline, you know, that keeps me like knowing kind of where things start and end in just events over time. But I do think, I didn't use one for my first book, and there are other platforms, but I do think that that has been a helpful tool for me in organizing my materials and my writing.
Fantastic.
I am also, we are not paid by Scrivener, but I also, it seems like it, because I am about to sing the same praises. I love Scrivener. For big projects, it's just such a, oh my God, it's a godsend. I mean, it's not for everyone. Some people hate it. So don't be thinking it's going to solve all your problems, but it definitely helps with that organization and with the idea of the Lego blocks, because the good thing about Scrivener is it allows you to so you have different note cards, so you can have different chunks of writing on these different sections, and then you can just drag the note cards into different positions and it automatically reorders your text. You got it.
That helps you with your outline and with your structure.
Yeah, because then you can literally, without much, with a click of a button, you can say, does this work better here? And you can see if it does automatically. And then you can revert back to the way it was if you don't like it. It's fantastic, I find, for that. What I do though, I mean, I'm much more like, my God, some of my practices are straight out of the pre-digital era. I have different research notebooks. So I have one that I took with me to the archive. I have an interview notebook, like my old journalist notebook, where I take all the notes when I'm talking to someone. I have that's separate. I have a separate notebook from when I'm looking at scientific research articles and taking notes on that. And so those are all dated. They all have some relationship to my PDF, massive PDF files. And I tend to try to, like, those themes, I tend to try to early on, like in the early stages, and don't worry if you're already past this, that's, you know, when you go back through your research, you can put them into different folders. So like, this is genetics, this is environment, this is lifestyle, which are 3 things that people think cause allergies. So when I'm reading something, I decide where it goes, and maybe it goes in multiple places, but like, so that's kind of how I keep track of what something is and where it goes, so that I can then call it up later. That tends to be how I organize things. And then that also does help you to see what you have, because then you have these folders and you're like, all right, what's the connection between all of this stuff? And that's where you start to find your outline, if that makes it, at least that's how I do it.
Fantastic. Great. Slightly different tack now. A couple of questions about dealing with feedback, particularly coming from your dissertation advisor. So one person has asked, you know, what do you do when you get conflicting feedback? And this sometimes happens if you're submitting an article and you may get peer review comments that you know, are at odds, or you might have a dissertation committee that doesn't agree and is giving you different feedback. There's also a sort of related question about someone has said that they've been told their draft reads too much like a book and not enough like a dissertation. So 2 questions about the dissertation. One is how do you deal with conflicting guidance? And how do you deal with, you know, what is a dissertation as opposed to, say, a book? Is there a difference?
All right, here's where I come in. Okay. Conflicting advice, that's tough, and I'm so sorry for you. That is really difficult, especially if, you know, if there's politics involved. Some of us deal with dissertation advisors that don't like each other or have very conflicting ideas of what something is and should be. If you're dealing with that and you are getting conflicting advice that diametrically opposes, you're going to have to come down on it because it's your project. That's the long and the short of it. You're going to have to make a decision about what you're going to do, and then in the nicest way possible, explain your rationale to the person who disagrees. Usually that's not going to be that big of a deal. I hope that's not your main dissertation advisor, because that can be tricky, but you really do have to adjudicate this because this is your project ultimately. So you need to like have an open mind and make sure that you're not emotionally reacting to their criticism as well. I find that you need to let that stuff steep for a few days, like really sit with their feedback and then try to parse it out and make up your own mind. That's the same advice for articles, by the way. Often you will get reviewer number 1 and reviewer number 2. Well, number 2 is supposed to be the terrible one. Reviewer number 1 and reviewer number 3 absolutely loved it. And then reviewer number 2 was like, it's not this article that I'd rather you have written. Well, and a book reviewer is going to do that same thing for dissertation. Like if you're going to try to make your dissertation into a book, the same process happens at university presses. It gets sent out for review. And what you have to do is you have to write a letter saying, I've looked at all this advice. I'm going to take person A's advice for this and person B's advice for that. And you're going to get this. That's exactly what you should do. There's probably something in their advice that you can take both, but it's going to be its own Frankenstein creation, and you're Frankenstein. So you're creating this monster. You get to decide what its head, heart, hands look like. As for too much like a book, you just asked the right person that. I got that because I was coming from journalism. So I was a natural, like that was a problem with my dissertation. They are different things. You're likely not, you're not probably bolstering your argument enough. So there are certain like, you know, formulae for dissertations, like ask, you know, if you can get more specific feedback, like what does that person mean when they say that? It might mean that you're not engaging in literature, or you're not locating your argument within the other arguments that have been made about your subject. That you're kind of, you know, you're erasing the lineage a little bit to make it more of your argument, which is more of what a book does, right? Like when I sit down to write this book, I'm not going to pay homage to the 3 people who wrote histories of allergy before me. Their work is in there. It's going to be in the suggested readings list, but I'm giving you my take on this stuff. What they want to see is what your take is vis-a-vis this community that you're a part of. So it's a different type of writing, which is why academic editors at presses constantly are saying you can't make your dissertation into a book. It's 2 different things because the focus is different. You're performing in your dissertation, and what you're performing is knowledge of the field and how your research extends it. In the book, you don't have to bother about performing that erudition. You're just saying what you know. I hope that helps you.
Super clear.
I'll tell just a funny story about that. When I was getting my master's degree, one of my professors said to me, wow, your writing is so engaging, but you really lack academic style. And I was like, if I get this academic style, I'm not going to have a job.
Right?
But there is this tension, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We have a question specifically for Rachel. How, I could apply to Theresa as well, but the audience member asks whether Rachel could say more about how you balance your book writing while teaching and journalism as well, because I assume you're doing plenty of that alongside the teaching. How do you balance your different responsibilities?
So I think honestly, this is one of the toughest parts of being an academic. And I'm a new faculty member. This is my 3rd year at NYU. And initially, that's when I was joining NYU, I was kind of asking everyone, well, how is it that you do this actually? And so I've learned a couple of things. One, it's hard. It is hard. So get ready, it's hard. But really, it is about kind of breaking it into these different parts and kind of moving things along, as Theresa was saying, in a kind of sustainable way. I've learned to think about my job as which I've got teaching, I've got writing and publications, and then you're bringing your ideas into the world in some way, right? Your conferences and all of that, and your service. But all of that is connected by your idea, right? Whatever your idea is the connecting tissue to all of that. And I've learned kind of the rhythms of the semester, for instance. I can write more, and I try, and I've learned that I need to write more from, say, September through mid, maybe even a little late October. I front end any of my speaking, you know, on panels and stuff like that in that time before, you know, the papers and stuff come in and you know, start piling up, and I've got to, it's harder to do that. You know, you take very good use of the time, the breaks that you have, you know, winter break and summer break, spring break, still it helps. And then, you know, and then learning, which is difficult for someone who's used to kind of really working full time on writing, about doing it in small bites. One thing I'd also suggest to people, I actually got this suggestion over the summer, which was a really helpful suggestion, was I've started, when I'm very organized, to put together lists of things that I can do in 15 or 20 minutes. Okay, so because sometimes, honestly, you know, I've got, all of a sudden, I've got like a half hour, and okay, what am I doing with it? That's valuable time. But if I have a list of things, you know, actually, I'm going to organize, I'm going to upload these, you know, these files into Scrivener that I have. I'm going to send a bunch of emails out to this archive that I have. It is a kind of, I feel like I'm working in bite-sized chunks all the time. And I think, as Theresa said, I think that's the only way to do it in a way that's sustainable. It's not like inspiration doesn't come, and those days will come where you feel like, oh my gosh, all I want to do is write, and I can. But for the long haul, I feel like breaking it up is what's been helpful to me. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear what Theresa has to say about it.
Briefly, I just want to say, it also sounds like that approach, that technique, is a great way to avoid burnout, which has been another question we've had. That if you're sort of moving from one thing to another, or you're doing things in small pieces, you're not biting off the whole thing and trying to chew it all at once. You're mixing it up a little bit so you won't get overwhelmed or tired of something. Is that the case for you as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. Go, no, you go ahead.
I was going to say, it's funny because that's absolutely right. And it seems crazy to say that, okay, like I've got these multiple things. I've got my book that I'm writing on. I've got an article that I've got to do. I've got this committee work that I've got to do. I'm going to dedicate, and I will break up my day like this. It seems crazy, I know, but I will say, okay, today I'm going to do 30 minutes on that. And I'm going to do 20 minutes on this, and I'm going to get my syllabi. I'm thinking about my syllabi for the spring. I'm going to update that. I'm dedicating 20 minutes to that. And it seems like crazy to, even now, I think this is crazy, but it actually works day in and day out. And it makes it so much saner. By the time you get to that presentation you've got to do, that lecture you've got to do for undergraduates or something, you've been thinking about it. And I want to say also something that Theresa mentioned too, about your book, but I think about this a lot in terms of these other parts too, is free writing. Honestly, I think that is one of the best things that you can do. When I first started thinking about a panel discussion or a class that I'm teaching, I sometimes will say, the 15 minutes today that I'm spending on that is just sketching out ideas. And sometimes I'll take a walk on it. You can make this pleasant for yourself. It's beautiful. What are those few things? And it builds, it really does.
Yeah, and I think to go off on that, like when you were saying there's not a super big distinction between the research and the writing, I think that what people think of as writing, like they feel really down in the dumps if they haven't gotten their 250 words or whatever it is. But like often, like you are actually supporting the writing by doing these things like uploading the things into Scrivener and like emailing the person you know you need to interview, and that's all work on the book. And so, you know, thinking of it like that, am I doing something to support the writing, is just as valid. So if you have 15 minutes, it's not like you haven't worked on your book just because you didn't write 3 sentences. You have. If you've gone for a walk and you've thought, God, I don't know what I'm going to do with chapter 2, that's actually working on your book. So learning to think of it as less strict, like if I didn't produce 50 new words, if my document word count didn't go from 10,000 to 10,050, I did nothing. That's not necessarily true. And you will have days where you write, I don't know, 5,000 words, and you will have days where you don't write anything, but you still did something crucial to help your progress. And honestly, I love this idea of like, I do this too, but I didn't do it. I was really dumb for a long time. Don't be me. I really did this whole push thing. I would get like 2 days off and like write for 2 days and then be crazy. And it took me too long to understand that I get up and I do the exact same thing. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do 2 30-minute chunks for grading today, and then 2 30-minute chunks on writing. And then I fit those in, like where they go. I just did one before we hopped on this call. I kid you not. I have my interview right here as proof. Like I was sitting here getting in one of my 30-minute chunks right before we did that. And after a while, your brain will just want to do it. And so it won't take you that extra motivation because you'll be used to doing these little things all the time and thinking of them differently. It's kind of like a mindset change too, to like think about things like, what can I do today, and be realistic about it too. The thinking about what can I do in a half an hour really gets you into seeing how this really is piecemeal work. You're not going to write your book in a day. And I really feel there's some idea that people do not feel accomplished. Like they'll sit down, like, God, I really didn't get as far as I wanted. Of course you didn't. Like starting to see it as like a patchwork quilt that you're adding pieces consistently to. Over time, you're going to have this massive, gorgeous quilt. But in the beginning, it's going to look like nothing.
And I wish writers would, and I know I would like to hear more about it. I wish writers and academics would talk more about the messiness of this. This is not like, I mean, you see the end product and it looks awesome, and it is. But, you know, we're living our lives doing this too. You know, we have families, things go well, things don't, and you're juggling all of this, and you're doing this work, and it's all a piece. And I know myself, I would be really interested in hearing more about, I'm so interested in people's process, about the messiness of other people's process, because mine is sometimes pretty messy.
Oh, I almost jumped in when you said, you know, at the beginning so this is my first big book contract, you guys. Like getting a Random House book is a big deal. And there's a lot of pressure that comes with it. And there was a point where I was trying to figure out the structure of this book, where I was doing the chapter descriptions. And I thought to myself, is it too late to give the money back? Is it too late? I don't know if
I really have to do all this.
I really have to do it, because it just was so overwhelming. But that was because what I was doing was I was picturing this beautiful, perfect book at the book stand at the Strand. And I was not, like, the real process is like a complete mess. And I just felt so much pressure to have that perfect book. And once I got over that, now I'm fine. I'm totally fine. But that's where you've got to get with this, is that we all, I mean, it doesn't matter. Like I was a daily journalist for the first part of my life, and I was crunching out these stories every day. And You know, now I'm an academic that works much slower, but I've been writing consistently my whole life. And it's not like I get up every day, you guys, and go, you know who's a great writer? Me. You know who's gonna crush it today? Me. Like, you always have motivational issues, and every project is a challenge. That, not to get all Carol Dweck up in here, but it's really a mindset shift. It's like, you know, a growth mindset. Like, this is a challenge, I'm gonna figure it out. And, you know, letting yourself mess up. Like, if you have kids, I don't know how many of you have kids, or even if you have like siblings, your best friend, you would never treat them the way you treat yourself. And I think you would never say to your kid, why don't you know how to do this? And I think you need to be more like that when you're figuring out a project. It's hard. If it wasn't hard, everyone would have a book.
I feel like that's where we should stop, but fortunately we have more time because there's a lot more questions to address. One question that I really like and find fascinating and would like to hear from both Rachel and Theresa on is how do you decide how much to explain to an audience? So you have your material, you know what it's about, you know what you're trying to say, but are you writing for a friend who's not involved in your discipline and you want them to understand, or are you writing for your colleagues who do know what your research is about and the references and the backgrounds? And so I guess it's a question about audience, but it's also about how much of your data to give to your audience.
I say to thee, get yourself a writing buddy, someone who will read your work. And it will depend on what, you know who you're writing for. So if it's a dissertation, then like I said, it's a performative piece. Like, you are writing not just for yourself, you're writing to like show people that you have mastered your field. So get somebody in your discipline who's working on not necessarily the same topic, but within the realm. Like, if you're writing about medicine, get someone else who knows a lot about that field in the topic of medicine, and exchange documents, and they will quickly tell you what they don't understand. I mean, there's no writing without readers. And if you're writing in a vacuum, that's probably part of a lot of people's problems, and a part of a lot of writer's block is you're not sharing anything. You're not getting feedback at all. You're trying to work it all out on your own. So find somebody who looks like the type of reader that this piece of writing is meant for, and have them flag things. And they will say, I totally didn't understand this on page 17. Am I supposed to know what this is? And then you go, oh yeah, right, I have to go back and explain that. Or they'll be like, you don't need this, like everybody knows blah. You don't need to say blah. So you will get that kind of feedback from readers. That is what I would say.
Yeah, and I would say if you're writing for a popular audience, it's really important to make sure that you get someone who isn't in your discipline, who doesn't know it at all, who will read it and say, what? Or why do you have so much of that? Or when this is what's really interesting. Because sometimes when you're in the weeds in your subject, and we're talking about kind of the sparkling prose part a little bit here, just in terms of a wider audience, it's really your aunt, your cousin, your friend who isn't. It's really important to know what works for a mass audience reader as well. If again, you've got to know your audience.
So what do you do when you're in the middle of your project and you realize you need to do more research? Which I guess a related question is also, how do you know when you've done enough research?
It happens all the time. I mean, so sometimes for journalists and if you have a book project, I mean, your deadline is when you'll know because you don't have any more time. But that's one of the great things actually about writing. Even when you think, oh, no, I'm not done my research, so I'm not going to write. But actually writing informs you of a lot. In addition to the stuff we've talked about in structure, what works, what doesn't, it points out the holes that you have. You thought, oh my goodness, you realize, oh no, I don't know that. So I feel like I often have to stop myself and say, okay, I'm only going to do so much research in the midst of this. But I think that comes up all the time. Deadlines are very helpful because that's the end.
Yeah, I would echo that. Because you'll be writing around, you'll be like, it would be great if I knew this. And then you go out and you look for that piece. Like you'll be writing and you'll be like, God, wouldn't it be great if there was someone saying this right now? Go out and find that person to say this. I just emailed 3 more people for my book, and I've been researching and writing this for 3 years. And my deadline is soon. But I realized that there are some pieces that I really still need. Like it's fleshed out enough and I could probably get away with it, but I want it to be really solid. And there is no end. Like, I just had to rein myself in the other day because I discovered there's brand new research about a brand new cell that they thought did nothing. And now they recognize that it actually does a lot and it's related to the allergic pathway response. And I almost went nuts. I almost was like, stop everything. I've got to research for 18 years on this new cell. I've got to talk to everyone. And then I was like, whoa, no, I don't. And also because of the deadline, but also because at some point you're like, no, this is not what I'm arguing. And so you just have to kind of learn to, I'm sounding very Buddhist monk right now, but you need to be able to observe yourself and kind of know who you are. And I mean, have you ever heard the phrase rapturous research? That some people get into rapturous research and they're like, they just can't stop themselves. If you're that person, then you have to kind of know that about yourself and just be like, I've got enough. And you'll know when you have enough because you won't be able to fit it all in your book or all in your dissertation. But there will be moments where you're like, oh, I don't have anything about X once you start writing. So it's kind of a natural process that you kind of just have as you go.
So what do you do when there are large gaps in your research? Not because you've not looked for something. And Rachel, I'm thinking particularly, in researching the history of slavery, obviously there's a lot that doesn't exist in the historical record. Many voices are not present in the archive. But what do you do with that? What do you do when you're looking at your research and you're structuring your argument and you realize there's a big gaping hole here? How am I going to deal with this? Do I throw it all out the window? What do I do?
Yeah, so that's so many of us come into dealing with this kind of issue, and certainly writing about the 19th century and particularly about enslaved people in the 19th century and the 18th century, that's a real issue. One of the things I found in my first book, and it's the same here because they both deal with the history of slavery, is that I deal with the absence as a thing. It is a thing, and it's a thing for a reason. There are gaps and holes, and sometimes you can write nice things. You can be very writerly about these gaps, but they're there, and it speaks to the history of marginalization, right? Of enslaved people, that their stories aren't fully told. So that's one thing. The other thing is I've developed, all kinds of ways because I can't have a book that doesn't have voices, even though I am struggling mightily to find voices. So I found all kinds of things that help bring historical periods to life. Often what I'll do is try and find contemporaneous voices from the time. It may not have the people who this set of people that I'm looking for, but I'll find similarly situated people and find letters or narratives or memoirs written by similarly situated people in a given place or time. I use a lot of archival tools to bring places and things to life. Like, for instance, I'm interested in weather, okay? So like sometimes I'd like to be able to say it was a cold winter night. Well, you can do that in 1838. So, you know, no, but really, I mean, there are historical, the National NOAA, whatever it is, I'm gonna say it wrong. There's historical weather data. Almanacs are great subjects. That you can find lots of things about weather there. And I say that just to say that there are, or you know, you can find old newspapers, archives can kind of tell you a little bit about a particular time that your subject is in that will bring it to life. Another archival thing, and then I'll stop because not everyone cares about this kind of thing, but there are these amazing maps. They're called Samborn fire insurance maps. And if you can find them for your city at a given period of time, they will lay out the whole, you'll see a block, literally, because they were like fire, and they'll tell you what the structures were, that there was a church here, that there was a stable here. There are lots of ways through the archives to fill in and to give people a sense of kind of, to bring it to life on the page. But the reality is that, you know, sometimes it's just not there. And then I'm open with the reader about that.
Theresa, did you want to add something on this subject?
I often deal, so as an anthropologist, often people just are not going to talk to you. Whole groups of people. So in my last book, you know, I had a very hard time getting any Chinese officials to talk to me about their influenza response, for good reason, because they don't want to be on the record talking about something that they could get in trouble for. So that's the story. That's the story. So not getting access to the Chinese officials became something that I looked at from a different angle. So it became part of the pandemic about like, okay, let's look at the history of why you can't get good public health data out of China after a certain point in time. And that became the story. So you can always do that. Like I'm anticipating, I haven't done this chapter yet, but I have a chapter looking at pharmaceutical companies' involvement in creating treatments for allergies. They're not going to talk to me. I already know. Like maybe I'll get one person, but that's part of it. Like, why wouldn't they talk to me? Like, you know, they're making billions of dollars off of this. So like kind of using that as a piece of information, that's data. Like it's not a gap in data, it's data. It's data about the gap in data, if that makes sense. It's telling you something. So you need to like talk about what that is and find the story of that.
Fantastic, thank you. We've had a few questions, related questions about whether it's writing a book proposal or research grant. It's sort of writing about the project before maybe you've done the project, before you maybe have finished the research, but trying to get a head start on the next phase or to get funding to help you see it through. How do you write those kinds of texts when you don't have all the knowledge yet? Theresa, you were nodding your head, so I took that as
because people are
you were ready to go.
Well, just because I have done it. So this book that I'm writing now has been supported by a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Grant, which I wrote in 2 days because I had to, because I didn't find out about it, and then there was a deadline. And I had done only the historical archival research at that point. And I had to write an entire, they wanted chapter descriptions for all the chapters of the future book that had not been written and had not been researched. So I basically just used what I knew about the subject from what I had done. And it was a promissory note. It was like, here's the things I think I'm gonna find. Here are the questions I'm interested in. Here are the people I think I'm gonna talk to. Here are the places I think I'm gonna go. and you write what you think you're going to find from those things, from those sources, what questions you're interested in. And that's enough, because everybody in funding agencies knows it's a promissory note. It's not the real thing. What you're doing for them is, everything's about performance. So what you do for them is you perform that you know how to do research, and that you know how to do the thing that you're saying that you're going to do. Like that you have a plan. They want to see that you have a plan. So that's what it is. It's like your planning document. Think of it that way.
Rachel, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And of course you have to do that. I mean, because you'll need to apply for grants and funding to support your research. And but I mean, as Theresa said too, they know that too, right? I mean, they know you don't, they're supporting your research. So I think everything she said, and then just kind of relax a bit in knowing that, you know, this isn't expected to be a finished product. They are giving you support to help you get there.
I would just add a cautionary note: don't overpromise, thinking that that's going to get you the funding. Don't say some outrage, I'm going to do this, 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 and this. They know you're not.
They can see it. They can spot it a mile away.
They can spot it a mile away. So be feasible about what you say you're going to do. Don't make outrageous promises.
We have a question about style, about writing style, which is something you don't often hear discussed in academia. But there is an academic style, and some people do have their own writing style that is maybe in line with that or maybe not. But the question we've had is whether you both could say a little bit about finding your writing style. And does that come out of the research, or is that something else?
Okay, I'm gonna leave this. I'm gonna let Rachel do the hard work after I initially. In journalism, so I'm gonna start with how writers talk about it, which is your voice, right? Finding your voice. It's not that dissimilar to in academic circles. Like, for instance, whoever it is, the top names in your field, if I took their names off of a piece of writing, likely you would be able to guess within a range of people who wrote it. Like, they have their style, right? When I first started to do the dissertation, I got great advice, which was, you've read a lot of stuff by the time you start writing. Pick your 5 favorite books that you are in your area of study, or books that you wish you had written that are amazing, like you really like, not just the content but the way they're written, and have them on your writing desk. And in between, when you're taking a break or when you're fussing around, pick it up, open it to anywhere, and just start reading, and pay attention to the mechanics of that writer. Like, what are they doing? What's their balance of exposition with showing you the data? How are they transitioning from one thing to the other? Like, there's clues everywhere you look about how to find your style, and those are also, like, your favorite books are probably close to what you want to write like. So let the people who have gone before you show you the path. So look at the piece of writing, not like, if it's a car, you're not driving, a reader is just a driver of the car. You want to be the mechanic. Open that hood, look underneath, don't pay attention to the content of the sentences. Look at how they did what they did, and then try to mimic it. Try to steal their techniques and work it out, and eventually you'll find your style.
Yeah, pastiche is an interesting device for learning how to write. You imitate somebody else, and then you kind of learn what those tricks are, and then you can either keep what you like and discard what you don't. But it's an interesting technique. Rachel, did you want to jump in or finish Theresa's?
I was going to say I agree. I agree with that. I mean, I always tell my students, and it's something that I do a lot myself. I think if you really care about writing, you're reading. And I think that you know, if you care about writing, you're reading critically, and so you'll read it because it's beautiful and it speaks to you and it's powerful. But you really should, I think, I totally agree with what Theresa said, is think about why that works. Why does it work? And what made that powerful to you? And I often find that it can, just like she said, having those books there or reading something that's really powerful while you are writing is really inspiring. Now, you might think it may also make you feel like, oh, good Lord, I can never do that, which is also sometimes we think too. but it just, I don't know, there's something really nice about that. If you have the time to kind of be doing that in parallel. But again, like, look at the writing critically and analytically and see what you can take from it.
Richard, the comment you just made about, maybe reading a writer who you admire greatly and taking inspiration from that, but also maybe feeling a bit cowed, a little bit, intimidated, and maybe on your worst days, defeated by the example. We have had a couple of questions from people in the audience who are wondering how to sort of deal with feeling that, why am I doing this? And, I'm never going to measure up and, it's a dissertation, but, look what all these great writers have done. We all have those little moments. They all sort of sneak in every now and then. And how do you, Rachel, and then I want to hear Theresa as well, how do you deal with those voices?
I think that among the writers that I know, we sometimes joke like, when will we stop feeling like that? Honestly, I'm too old to be feeling like that, but we all do. And I would just say that, it's a process, okay? And so there are good days and bad days, and that's just anything. And writing is like that. And I think that if you accept that and you know that there are some days that you are just going to wake up and think, oh my God, this is terrible. I need to tear it up. And you might actually do that. You might need to do that. But, tomorrow is another day and you will get up and you will write some more. And I would just say, be kind to yourself about it. Again, I do find like, my metrics of, 500 words, 700 words, 200 words, whatever is helpful. But I'm also like, you had a hard day. Things didn't go well. You wrote something and you woke up the next morning and it didn't make any sense. And that's because there was just so much going on and your head was clouded, and that's life. But if you stop, if you give up, then you will never write that sparkling prose. You will never, it won't happen. So like writer's block is like, again, like you just keep going. That's what I would say. That's the most important thing, is just sometimes put it down. You're depressed. I'm depressed. We all feel that way. Do something else, take a walk. And again, I think sometimes the pacing that we've been talking about helps with that, because your whole life is all a part of this. Sometimes stepping away, doing something completely different, watching a movie, hanging out with people who have nothing to do with this, clears your head, whatever it is. Exercise for me is a huge thing, okay? Even if it is 10 or 15 minutes on my treadmill, it clears my head, whatever it is for you. But sometimes stepping away from the writing helps the writing. It's all a kind of continuum, I think.
Theresa?
Yeah, and a lot of us were drawn to these fields because we were in love with books. It's not an accident that you're in this Zoom. You grew up reading, you really wanted to do that thing. And then, so you have a high regard for this, right? And that you put pressure on yourself because you do have these heroes, like we all have these, oh my God, isn't so-and-so an amazing writer? And I'll never be like that. But if you hang around writers, working writers enough, you start to hear things like, you know, your dialogue is amazing. I don't know how you do it. And then someone will be like, yeah, but your sentence structure is so amazing. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses of their own writing. Everybody. It doesn't matter who it is, Kerouac, Hemingway, you know, in the famous academic in your field who just writes lyrically. They all have something they don't do well, that they've had to practice. And, you know, just keeping that in mind, that this is not, writing is not a natural skill set, but I think that we think it is. Like, some people are just born great writers. Well, is that true? I mean, those of us who grew up reading a lot probably have a natural inclination to write because that's what we're doing. But it always takes practice. It's a continuing thing. It's not a fixed quantity. You don't have it's not pie. There isn't a certain amount of talent that you have and then that's it. You've hit the limit and that's it for you. Like, that's not true. You're always learning, and you're always, if you are doing it right, like this project that I'm working on right now is challenging me a lot. And I'm, you know, a good writer, and I know that about myself, but there are days when I'm like, I don't see any evidence of it right now because I'm challenged by the project. And so I'll have days where I'm like, geez, this really is horrible, but I have done it long enough. I am now, you know, almost 50 years old. I've been doing this since I was, you know, my first day of journalism school at 18. And I just know that it's going to pass, that it's an artifact of what we do, and it's temporary. It's like the weather. It will change. You know, in a week, I'll feel like, you know, everyone else sucks and I'm the best writer ever, and then that'll go. Like, it's just, it comes and goes in waves, and you just got to know that, and don't believe that the days when you're telling yourself that it's a fixed quantity. It's not. You know, like, the more you do it, and if you do write daily, you'll see that. You'll see it more because you're writing daily, and you'll see, oh, well, yesterday I wrote fine and today is not a great day, but I know because I've done this for 3 months in a row now. You'll get more used to those days when you feel like crap.
Great.
I also wanted to mention, because I know we're going to be wrapping up, there are 2 books that I have found helpful. One, a colleague recommended to me as a new academic, and I think it would be useful. I found it useful for people who are new, like I am, to kind of this balancing. And it's a very small book called How to Write a Lot, A Practical Guide to Productive Academic Writing. And the other one, and it's so short, it's a paperback. I thought it was awesome. And then I mentioned Robert Caro's book on writing, which is just called Working, which, you know, again, I just really, his books are so amazing. And I just really enjoyed reading about his working life.
Theresa, do you have some resources you'd like to share?
No, I don't really. Is that horrible?
We did have someone asked earlier, just to clarify that the software you both use, Scrivener?
Scrivener. Yeah.
With a V, not a B, not the publisher, but the, okay.
Yeah,
Scrivener.
it's pretty cheap, and you can get, I think it's like $50 if you have an .edu email address. I'm constantly reading how-to books though, like, to say that I don't use them, that's not, I just don't have any one. Like, I'm trying to see the book that I currently have on my desk right now. I think it's called The Elements of Story. And it's by a longtime New York Times editor, talking about, like, it doesn't matter what you're writing or what type of thing you're writing. There are certain things that have to, like, that everything's a narrative. And so it's like a book talking about, like, structure and how you find your structure. And so I'm reading that right now because it's helping me work out my own structure. So I'm constantly reading about writing because I find it soothing. Like, I love to read how other people suffer and how hard it is. It's
to solve problems. Also how they solve their suffering.
Yeah, like, I mean, these are very prolific people and they all have the same problems. And it's very nice to read about that, but also to, like, you know, like I agree with Rachel. I love hearing people say how they do what they do, because it's just, it's soothing and it's inspiring. So get yourself, just go to the Strand, like, you know, and they have that section. It's in the back corner. There's a whole stack of writing how-to books. Just buy 3 of them, you know, and just like peruse.
Terrific. Thank you so much. We didn't get to all of the questions, and I apologize to those people we weren't able to respond to. But I want to thank Rachel Swarns and Theresa McPhail so much. Your advice and counsel and tips and strategies were so helpful and so informative. And I know we're all going to be better writers now, or rather more disciplined writers, I think is the goal, the first goal anyway. Again, thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for coming. And a shout out also to Kyla Bowen, who is behind the scenes, pushing buttons and making everything work. So thank you all for participating in this event.